Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. It's Wednesday, August 5th, 2026, episode 565, and we're going to talk about Ryan Long's comedy. Maybe you know him, maybe you don't, but before we do, I just want to make a little note that I was listening to a podcast hosted by Glenn Deason, who is a professor over in Europe somewhere. And he has this podcast on the greater Eurasia issues. And so he had Colonel Wilkerson on today. Colonel Wilkerson used to be the chief of staff for Colin Powell, who used to be Secretary of State during the Bush era. And basically, they were discussing the decline, if not the collapse, of the West, primarily the United States. And at the root of this collapse is the lack of diplomacy. And so this crassness, this obnoxiousness that helped get Trump elected here in the United States fails on the global stage. There is no diplomacy right now between the United States and anyone else in the world. And we already talked about the perfidy, U.S. murdering uh, diplomats and negotiators coming to talk about how to get peace with Iran. We also talked about how Trump basically lies all the time about how he's about to get a deal, but there is no deal. And the lack of awareness on Trump's administration when it comes to cultural differences and the sheer arrogance of people like Trump when they talk about and look at people from other countries, right? These are just primitive people. They live in a desert. They're nomads. They don't have civilization. They don't have culture. All they have is fanatical religion and so condescending. And this is very much in contrast with Asian culture. Now, I'm not saying that Asia does not have its fair share of arrogant, corrupt people. They do. However, as a culture, the way they express themselves. Still, it's changing, but still, at this point, you don't use that kind of crass language. You don't use profanity in the public space because it's not the place for it. You have to be aware. You have to be super polite. You have to be aware of the culture, the norms, the expectations, the etiquette of other people. So I believe that there is a standardized international etiquette that when you meet diplomats of other countries, there's a certain protocol that you have to follow. And then part of when I talk about Asia, we have to keep in mind that the Middle East and Russia, part of Asia as well. And so this mentality that is poo-pooed very much by the Trump administration, if not also by a lot of Americans, is actually important and something that Americans should be aware of, but unfortunately don't care too much about. So it's in this dark context, right? So all of these horrible things are going on in the world. I mean, the collapse of the United States, the collapse of the dollar is happening right there. And it's all very dark. It's all very depressing, which is why I love comedy, right? So comedy is something to sort of release and help us not to become so depressed that we are trapped in a loop of inaction, right? So, and I've said this before on this channel, but then now it's been a couple of years so since I started, and I used to be the angry Asian guy. So growing up in the United States, I would see things that were shown to me as being unjust, and I could relate to it because I was always bullied as the Asian guy, as the minority, not only by all the different ethnic groups in America, but also by other Asians because I wasn't ever Asian enough. Um, but I, over time, I realized that being angry all the time is so tiring. I mean, when you're young and you're learning all this stuff for the first time, you have this righteous rage and you have infinite amount of energy. And so, excuse me, you don't really notice how much work is involved in being angry all of the time, right? Pointing out racism in everything, which is kind of funny. And I've talked about this before, but people used to roll their eyes whenever you talk to someone who is studying African American studies, because every time you talk about something, they would point out how it was racist. And so people would say, oh, come on, right? They would get tired of like, you're going too far with it. But no, it actually not. The only reason why people got tired of it is because it always came from the same perspective, right? From the black perspective, black oppression and things of that. There's no other subjectivity. And so to, uh, you know, embrace that subjectivity is to adopt and live someone else's life. And I've talked about this before, how a lot of race theory is the process of getting everybody else to share their perspective. And so the author, the one who produces this perspective, makes this knowledge, is basically gaining power the more that other people will agree with them. But in any case, so I decided to go reject the angry aspect of life, being angry all the time, like, oh, that's racist, this is oppressive, because I realized it's a lot easier to be happy because there's a lot of funny everywhere, right? In the same way that someone might say, oh, that's racist. Yeah, it's funny because if you change your subjectivity, what used to be sort of a cause of anger now becomes funny. And when I say funny, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is not grotesque, it is disgusting, it is cruel. I'm not saying that cruelty is funny, but the idea of funny, the idea of comedy, um, it changes depending on your context. And I've talked about gallows humor before, or the humor of nurses and doctors in the ICU, the intensive care unit, because they are surrounded by death. What becomes funny and entertaining becomes is horrifying to the average person who is not in that context. And so that's another thing that I'd take into consideration is that all funny is the violation of expectation. I'll get into that a little bit more later, even though I've already talked about it before. So I used to teach class in this way, pointing out hypocrisy, right? So when you exposing the funny side of something, the process of doing that is sharing a different subjectivity, a different perspective on what you thought was offensive. And so comedy, a lot of what comedy is consideration of alternate subjectivities. And I used to teach class this way, pointing out alternate subjectivities, pointing out how this basically means if you're only going to advocate for one subjectivity and ignore everyone else's, you're engaging in hypocrisy, which is rejected in this class. Like you can have that subjectivity, you can maintain that, but it'll be a hard sell on everybody else because it's hypocritical. And so the theme of the class that I would always teach was to have respect for other subjectivities, for other perspectives, which means then you get to reintroduce comedy into everything. So there is a funny aspect, even a morbid, dark comedy aspect to everything. And so the only unproductive subjectivity was a hypocritical one. Otherwise, if you want to maintain a subjectivity which is not hypocritical, more power to you. So comedy, there was one point in the class where I would have this little a day where I would just it was an opportunity for me to show comedy clips, and I would ask, "Is it racist?" Right? So I would play a bit that was meant to be entertaining, that was meant to be funny, and then I would ask, "Is it racist?" And of course, the answer was always yes. And so the trick was to figure out which expectation was violated or how you can look at the situation from a different subjectivity. And it was actually pretty entertaining. Even the most hardcore of sort of radicalized person had to at least chuckle at some of them. They probably felt embarrassed that they laughed at something that otherwise they would have just jumped down someone's throat for saying. But then they could, because by this time, halfway through the semester, they could see the argument, they could see the subjectivity, and so therefore they began to see the humor. Now, traditionally, I'm more of the family comedy type person, so the Jim Gaffigan type of comedy. But you have to you get exposed to all the different kinds of comedy. And so no matter the genre, whether you consider them good comedians or bad comedians, well, I take that back. Good comedy, and I'll recognize good comedy as good, even if I don't like it, even if I don't laugh at a single joke. I will admit and concede that the comedian is good because they're engaging in that exercise of exposing subjectivities. So there was a time when all the late night talk show hosts were just simply sharing the propaganda of the government and the and just saying, look at all these idiots who are disagreeing. And that was all their comedy, right? So it wasn't a sharing of different subject, pointing out different subjectivities, but laughing at the people who don't agree with you. That's not good comedy. Now, good comedy is pointing out unknown subjectivities, which makes the original position a little bit shakier, right? It's not as absolute as a lot of people want it to be. And that's good comedy. I find that good comedians, people who engage in this exercise of exposing subjectivity, are really smart. They're quick-witted, jealous all the time. And I've said this every single time I talk about a comedian. I just admire their quick-wittedness. I'm very, very slow. And so even the way that I teach is reactive. I listen to what other people say. That way it takes the pressure off of me to come up with new material. I just simply respond to what other people are saying. But when you start getting into the more mature comedy, it's very, very edgy, often very, very morbid. But and interesting, I'll point out too that the two most viewed episodes of my podcasts are about comics. So most recently, Erin Wexler, I talked about her as being a professional racist, and I'm still getting views on that. And my highest viewed episode ever was on Leonardo Joni, episode 269. Aaron Wexler's episode was 530, and Leonardo Joni was 269. And she claimed to be the most banned female comic, and so I had to listen to her, right? And her great uh, approach, at least the way I see it, is how hate speech is the loophole for censorship. And so a lot of her comedy comes from what a lot of people would call hate speech. Now, Aaron Wexler, a professional racist, so self-identified as a professional racist, it's all about violating benign violation theory, right? So you have an expectation of a person based on a stereotype that we don't call a stereotype anymore, and she violates the expectation, right? She presents a situation which does not conform to what other people are expecting to see or hear. So, which brings us to Ryan Long. I don't know. I get a lot of comedians, uh, comedian stuff. Uh, I enjoy, like I said, I enjoy comedy. But Ryan Long's came up, and I guess he's the first dude I'm going to be talking about. And because I get a lot of female comics, but which is also interesting because comics are generally stereotyped as being predominantly male. But Ryan Long, and I don't really actively seek out good comedy. See, that's the thing. And so Ryan Long came up, and I was really impressed because he would do these street interviews. And the process of doing this street interview is to either embrace a stereotype or a trend or to present a different subjectivity on a certain racialization or a trend. And it was really interesting. And so I started listening to a lot of his clips, and on YouTube, he has two YouTube long videos of his stand-up act, his routine that he gives at comedy clubs. And they are much more vulgar. So this is sort of fair warning that if you do listen to anything that Ryan Long does, it's he takes no prisoners. All right, everything is there. I'll talk more about that in a moment. I give you some examples of his street interviews. He asked some women what what could be done to increase the ratings, the viewership for women's sports. How about having the athletes go topless? And of course, everyone's really offended, you know. But the point is to increase the ratings, the viewership of women's sports because not a lot of people are interested in watching women's sports. And so people are getting really offended. And so he's like, oh, well, what do you think we should do if not for topless athletes? And so the one woman goes, we have to educate pe more people for women's rights. Right, which is kind of like, okay, yeah, that'll solve the problem. No, that the whole point is that it has to be entertaining, and most people just don't want to tune in to women's sports. Uh, and that's the problem. WNBA over my lifetime, I know that the most recent iteration of WNBA is not the first. There was at least one other attempt before, which had big time male basketball athlete support and sponsorship, and that failed as well. So, what would it take to increase interest in women's sports? And it's not an easy thing. And to talk about education for women's rights, yeah, education and sport generally stand at odds with each other. So it's kind of funny. So the humor comes from also a lot of the answers, how you point out the subjectivity, the problem of the mindset, and then you have just simply more of the same in reply, which is funny. And then, okay, so then he says, this must have been during the election primaries for the Democrats the last time around. And so he asked people whose breasts were better, Kamala Harris or Elizabeth Warren. And some women were really offended by this. You know, what are you talking about? These are women. They have platforms. Talk about that. Why are you talking about their breast size? And so he would say, keep pressing the matter. It's like, what are you talking about? You know, I'm just asking, you know, who has a better rack than the other? And he kept using all the different synonyms for breasts. And so, and the people who were, you know, offended kept responding to it, which is also part of the comedy. Now, why is this funny? Why should this be funny? Well, because what they're actually saying is meaningless. It's a distraction from the fact that they know nothing. I mean, it's no secret that Kamala Harris was probably an alcoholic and was drunk most of the time. And Elizabeth Warren is a pathological liar, claiming to be Native American at one point in her life. So that was just kind of, so whatever it is that they say is absolute BS. So why not just talk about their body? And then there's another bit where he is going up to people saying, hey, we're trying to raise money for necrophiliac awareness. And if you don't know necrophilia, it's having sexual relations with dead people. And so he's saying, do you want to donate your body to necrophiliac awareness, you know, for all these guys? And so people are just disgusted. It's just so, it's just horrible. It's weird. It's even in the Bible, they talk about it, I'm pretty sure. And it's a sin. Yeah, this is evil stuff. And I think the comedy comes from the fact that all activism, all this attempt to raise awareness is problematic. Now, some people are disgusted at necrophiliac awareness. So why can't other people be disgusted by your activism? Just because you believe that that is a great something that everyone should know about, does it mean that it's not disgusting, that no one else is allowed to feel disgusted at what you are trying to raise awareness about? And so there's that kind of thing. And then he goes up to they look like college students, and 90% of offshore interrogators are men. How do we get more women involved? Equality. And what was hilarious is that because there's just a lack of creativity and flexibility within a lot of these programmed, brainwashed people, is that they still go into the same response, right? Oh, well, a lot of people are programmed to be oppressed and automatically, disqualify themselves for certain jobs, right? So, yeah, there should be more equality in offshore torturers, And so what's so crazy is that a lot of people have such a one-track mind. There's no flexibility, there's no awareness of the problems within their subjectivity that it actually is becomes their morality. In other words, things that are immoral, like torture, is beside the point, right? We need to get more women into the torture field, right? Because of equality. And so morality takes a back seat uh, so that you can have their morality, their sense and idea of what is truly moral as being superior. So equality in torture is the goal. And that's what's so funny. And if you can do that with offshore interrogators, imagine what you can do with some of these other topics that you're not allowed to make fun of, right? Hey, we're trying to raise awareness. Why are you laughing at that, right? And so, depending on your subjectivity, depending on your context, certain things become funny and others not. And I don't have time to go into how cancer awareness can be turned into a joke, but understand that there is no sacred space. There is no off limits topic. Everything has subjectivity, and depending on your context, you can make it funny. So, on average, um, basically, so then he has a podcast. I forget what it's called. Something male oriented anyway. So, but there's one clip where he talks about the expression on average, men are stronger than women. And he says, too many people in America just don't understand what that means on average. And so you say on average men are stronger than women, they will proceed to tell you they know a woman who's stronger than a lot of men. But that's called an exception. But an average, basically, mathematical average is you add up everybody, add up all of the values, then you divide by the number, and then you get the mathematical midpoint, right? The middle value of whatever it is you're talking about. And so if you add up the strength of all of the men, how much weight they can lift, and you add up all of the women, how much they can lift, and you divide the total amount of weight by the number of men or women, and you get the average. And it means that there are a lot of people who can lift more and a lot of people who can't even lift the average. And so if you cross and compare, you'll have some women that are stronger than a lot of men. Yeah, but that would be the exception. Median is another way of looking at it. That's the middle value, right? So you take all the men and you see how much they can lift, and then you take the person smack in the middle, and then you do that with women. Yeah, generally the median male will be lifting more than the median female. Okay, assuming a two-gender society. Okay, So men and women comparison, and then you got Asians and math, right? On average, Asians are better than white people in math, right? It's an average. Uh, so they're talking about stereotypes and then breaking the stereotype, right? That's really what this little bit that they had was all about. On average, the average is the stereotype, and then the exceptions are the breaking of the stereotype. Now, people get offended and they make the argument that stereotypes shouldn't exist. But then if you get rid of stereotypes, then there's no place for exceptions, for exceptionality to be exceptional. Um, because all a stereotype is a generalization. It's an average. And then the exceptions are the specifics. All right. And I've talked about this before. That's what race is all about. Race is just simply a generalization, a category. You're all lumped in the same category because you all share the same characteristic, right? People who are 5'10". You see, I mean, now everyone who's 5'10", you're all put in the same category because you're 5'10". But every person who's 5'10", you're different. Right. And so the more you get into specifics, the more detail that you introduce, the more you narrow the category, right? The number of people in that category becomes smaller and smaller until you're down to one single person, and that's the individual, which is why I always say the smallest racial group is the individual. Now, he's extremely offensive, I would imagine, and people who go out to see his comedy, have to know that ahead of time because he goes everywhere. But I believe a lot of people are offended by his comedy because they see it as a threat. Uh, because he does not leave any area of life untouched. He will make fun of, reveal subjectivity about pretty much everything. And I thought, wow, this is really interesting because uh, before, Leonardo Johnny got banned for saying things that are not even as controversial and vulgar as the stuff that he's saying. She got banned. And here, a couple of years later, and apparently he's been doing comedy for years, he not get banned is I don't think it's a gender discrimination thing, but I never saw any of his YouTube videos prior to this week. So I'm wondering, are the algorithms changing? Is society's attitude towards comedy changing? You can credit Trump for that, maybe, or at least because of Trump, it became okay to make fun of a lot of this stuff. Maybe it's because of things like the Fauci hearings that are making people realize that going all in on a narrow subjectivity is problematic, it's risky, uh, and therefore you also, at the same time, by going all in on one subjectivity, you lose your sense of humor. So our society, I believe, has become that ridiculous. I mean, the fact that he can pretty much go everywhere with his comedy, that's how much narrow subjectivity there is in our world today, in the Western world. There's activism for everything, whether it's for Palestine or for Israel, for Ukrainians or for Russia. I mean, there is activism everywhere for everything. And so that basically becomes the breeding ground for comedy. And any of these activisms that are pushed by all of these activist types, they have to keep it superficial because if you go a couple steps further, you start running into each other. In other words, you start running into contradictions or hypocrisy. And that's another aspect of his street interview is when he goes even further with his comedy, like equality for torturers, for example, right? Where you ignore what should be generally rejected by society and you go to embrace it, right? I mean, it's funny because the girls that were asked that question started saying, "Well, this is how we can get more women into an illegal criminal behavior." It's just so weird. Like, so morality takes a back seat in all of this activism. There's so much raising attempts of people to raise awareness. I mean, the calendar is full of awareness days to the point where it becomes kind of meaningless. So you pick and choose the kind of awareness you want to support with your money, or you don't. And the whole time where people are shopping for their, activism, the world is burning because of U.S. foreign policy, right? So the morality now becomes obfuscated. It becomes kind of a backseat to whatever cause or whatever awareness you want to promote. And I wish it was a joke, but at the end of the day, people are dying. And soon we might be on the receiving end of a lot of the stuff that we've been exporting to other countries. Like, I think a lot of Americans would be shocked when bombs and missiles start falling on major cities in the United States, and to have a world leader on the other end saying, oh, we need to get this government to submit. And I mean, how would we respond? How would we feel if that happens when people we know, people in our family, start getting killed? So comedy, I believe, helps people to become more aware of the hypocrisy, the potential hypocrisy, and a lot of the social awareness efforts, movements that we have in our society, and how much of a cost and how much injustice it promotes in our society today. In other words, a lot of this activism is doing the opposite of what they were hoping for. And unfortunately, because of the cooperation of selfish politicians, they're willing to go along with it so that they can use them to achieve or at least hide a lot of the things that they want to do, like even their own personal corruption. So anyway, once again, had to do an episode on comedy, uh, and to show just how important comedy is for society and the important role that it serves. And after coming out of a couple of years of massive censorship of comedy, I think hopefully we'll be able to start having more offensive comedy to raise awareness of how corrupt the system actually is. That's it for today. I will talk to you next time.